The arrival of the plague in the middle of the 14th century, the world changed forever. Between 1347 and 1351, a terrifying disease known as the Black Plague, or the Black Death, swept across Europe, killing millions and leaving entire towns in silence. No one knew where it came from or how to stop it. To the people of the time, it felt like the end of the world. The plague arrived in Europe through trade routes that connected Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Merchants, ships, and travelers carried not only goods, but also the invisible killer. It first appeared in Sicily in 1347, when 12 merchant ships from the Black Sea docked at the port of Messina. When people went to greet the sailors, they were met with a horrifying sight. Most of the sailors were already dead, and those still alive were covered in black boils filled with blood and pus. Within days, the disease spread through the town, and from there, it began its deadly march across Europe. The spread. Across Europe from Italy, the plague moved swiftly. It reached France, Spain, Germany, England, and eventually Scandinavia. In just a few years, it covered nearly all of Europe. Medieval cities were crowded, dirty, and filled with rats. People threw garbage and waste into the streets, and it was common to see animals wandering freely. This made it easy for the fleas that carried the plague to spread from rats to humans. The speed was terrifying. Some towns were wiped out in days. Whole families died in their homes, and there were often not enough people left to bury the dead. In cities like Florence, Paris, and London, carts filled with corpses were dragged through the streets to mass graves. People locked themselves indoors, hoping to escape infection. But the plague seemed to find everyone. By 1351, it is estimated that over 25 million people, about one-third of Europe's entire population, had died. In some areas, the death rate reached 60% or more. Villages were abandoned, fields went unharvested, and cities turned into ghost towns. The three forms of the plague. The Black Plague was actually not one single disease, but three related forms caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. These were the bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic plagues. Bubonic plague was the most common. It caused painful, swollen lumps called buboes, usually found under the arms, in the groin, or around the neck. Victims suffered from fever, vomiting, and chills. Death usually came within a few days. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs. It could spread through the air when an infected person coughed. This made it even deadlier, because it didn't rely on fleas or rats to move from person to person. Victims could die within a day or two. Septicemic plague was the rarest but most deadly. It infected the blood, causing the skin to turn black from internal bleeding. People often died within hours of showing symptoms. Because there was no understanding of bacteria or infection, people in the Middle Ages could not stop the disease from spreading. Medieval explanations and superstitions in the 14th century. Science and medicine were still very primitive. People did not understand germs, and doctors could not explain how the disease spread. Many believed it was God's punishment for the sins of humanity. Others thought it was caused by bad air, poisoned wells, or even witchcraft. The church played a major role in how people reacted. Priests told their followers to pray and repent. In many towns, people marched in religious processions, whipping themselves with ropes to show their sorrow and beg for forgiveness. These groups were known as flagellants. They traveled from city to city, chanting prayers and punishing themselves, believing their suffering could end the plague. But superstition also led to fear and hatred. Some people blamed minority groups, especially Jews, for poisoning wells or spreading the disease. In many parts of Europe, Jewish communities were attacked and massacred, a dark and tragic part of the plague's history. Life and death in the time of the plague. Daily life during the Black Death was filled with fear. People avoided one another, refusing to touch or even speak to strangers. Trade stopped, markets closed, and farms were left empty. Doctors wore long robes, gloves, and bird-shaped masks filled with herbs and vinegar, believing the strong smells would protect them from the bad air. These plague doctors have since become one of the most haunting symbols of the era. Families were torn apart, parents abandoned sick children, and friends turned away from each other in terror. Many people fled to the countryside, thinking they could escape the disease. But the plague followed them. Priests, nuns, and monks tried to care for the dying, but many of them perished too. In cities like Florence, chroniclers such as Giovanni Boccaccio described scenes of horror and hopelessness in his famous work, The Decameron. The plague also brought deep psychological changes. People began to believe that life was short and fragile. This gave rise to the Dance of Death, an artistic theme showing skeletons dancing with kings, peasants, and nobles alike, reminding everyone that death came for all, economic collapse and transformation. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it destroyed the medieval economy. With so many workers dead, fields could not be harvested, and food became scarce. Prices for goods rose, while wages for workers increased because labor was in short supply. For peasants and farmers, this created a strange new opportunity. Before the plague, most peasants were tied to the land under a system called feudalism. They worked for powerful lords and received little in return. After the plague, the shortage of workers gave peasants the power to demand better pay and working conditions. Some even left their villages to find better opportunities elsewhere. This change slowly weakened the feudal system. Lords could no longer control peasants as easily, and many noble families lost wealth and power. The middle class, merchants, craftsmen, and traders, began to grow stronger. Over time, the old medieval way of life started to fade away, making room for new economic and social structures. The decline of the Church's authority during the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in Europe. But when the plague struck, even the Church could not offer protection or explanation. People prayed for miracles, but the deaths continued. Many priests died caring for the sick, and those who survived sometimes refused to perform last rites or funerals out of fear. As a result, many people began to lose faith in the Church. They started questioning its teachings and authority. This doubt would grow in the following centuries and eventually lead to the Renaissance and the Reformation, movements that changed religion and thinking across Europe. At the same time, the Church also grew richer. Families donated land and money to monasteries in hopes of saving the souls of their loved ones. Yet the Church's inability to stop the suffering revealed its human weaknesses. For the first time, ordinary people began to seek answers beyond religion and to trust reason and observation. The rise of medicine and science, the horror of the Black Death, forced people to think differently about health and disease. Although medicine was still based on old ideas from ancient Greece and Rome, some doctors began to question traditional beliefs. They studied symptoms, recorded cases, and searched for real causes. Over time, cities started to introduce early public health measures, quarantines, isolation zones, and laws to clean streets and remove waste. The city of Venice, for example, built special plague houses where sick people were kept away from others. Ships arriving from infected ports had to wait 40 days before docking. This is where the word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. These small steps marked the beginning of modern public health and epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread. The plague's cultural and artistic impact. The Black Death left a deep mark on art, literature, and culture. Artists began to paint darker themes, focusing on death, decay, and the afterlife. Skeletons, skulls, and grim reapers appeared frequently in murals and church decorations. The message was clear: death spares no one. Writers and poets reflected on the fragility of human life. Works like The Decameron by Boccaccio and The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer captured both the despair and the resilience of people during this time. Art and literature became more focused on individual experience and emotion, helping lead Europe toward the Renaissance, a new age of creativity and humanism. How the plague reshaped society. By the time the plague finally faded, Europe was transformed forever. The old medieval world, ruled by kings, nobles, and the church, began to break apart. The huge loss of life led to social mobility, as survivors could demand better lives. Towns grew, trade revived, and education spread. The trauma of the plague also encouraged people to look beyond religion and to explore the world through science, art, and discovery. It marked the beginning of the end of the Middle Ages and the birth of a new era, the Renaissance. Later outbreaks and lasting legacy. Although the worst wave of the Black Death ended around 1351, the plague continued to return for centuries. Outbreaks appeared again and again in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. One of the most famous later outbreaks was the Great Plague of London in 1665, which killed tens of thousands of people. Modern science eventually discovered that the Black Death was caused by a bacterium spread by fleas living on rats. It was only in the 19th century that doctors fully understood how it worked. Even so, the memory of the plague remained powerful. It shaped how future generations thought about disease, death, and survival. The human experience of suffering and survival. To truly understand the impact of the Black Plague, we must imagine what it felt like to live through it. The medieval world was already hard. People struggled with hunger, cold winters, and endless wars. But the arrival of the plague brought a new kind of terror. It was invisible, unstoppable, and deadly. At first, people didn't know how to react. Some prayed day and night, hoping for mercy. Others ran away from their homes, abandoning loved ones to save themselves. There were those who tried to celebrate and enjoy life while they could, drinking and dancing to forget their fear. The phrase, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die," became a grim reflection of the time. Graveyards filled faster than anyone could imagine. The living grew too afraid to bury the dead. Bodies were often left in homes until the smell forced neighbors to drag them out. Mass graves became common. Huge pits, where hundreds of corpses were buried together, without names or prayers. The death bells of churches rang so often that people stopped noticing them. Yet, amid the horror, some showed great courage. Priests, nuns, and doctors risked their lives to comfort the sick. Ordinary people shared what little food they had with dying neighbors. Even in the darkest hour, humanity's compassion flickered like a small candle in the endless night of fear. The global reach of the Black Death. While most people associate the Black Death with Europe, it was actually a global pandemic. It began far away, in the plains of Central Asia, around the year 1331. There, the plague lived among wild rodents like marmots and was spread by fleas. It is believed that Mongol armies and traders traveling along the Silk Road carried the infection westward, through China and the Middle East, and eventually into Europe. The plague devastated many Asian regions before it even reached Europe. In China, millions died as entire towns were wiped out. The Mongol Empire, which had united much of Asia under one rule, began to collapse as the disease spread through its trade routes. When Mongol forces besieged the city of Kaffa, in modern-day Crimea, they reportedly catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, one of the first known examples of biological warfare. The terrified defenders fled by ship, unknowingly bringing the plague to Europe. The plague also reached North Africa and parts of the Middle East, killing countless people from Egypt to Syria. The disease did not respect borders, religions, or empires. It struck kings and peasants alike. It was a global disaster that changed the shape of every civilization it touched. The impact on cities and urban life. Medieval cities were perfect breeding grounds for disease. They were overcrowded and sanitation was nearly non-existent. Streets were filled with trash, animal waste, and stagnant water. Houses were small and packed close together, with entire families sharing a single room. Rats thrived in this environment, moving freely between homes, markets, and ships, carrying death with them. As the plague spread, cities quickly fell apart. In Florence, one of the richest cities in Europe, 2/3 of the population died within months. Paris lost more than half its people. In London, so many died that the city had to dig massive burial trenches known as plague pits. Trade and business came to a halt. Ships sat empty at docks, and marketplaces fell silent. Guilds, organizations of craftsmen and merchants, lost their members, and many never recovered. In some places, entire trades disappeared because no one was left to continue them. When the survivors returned, they found their cities eerily quiet. Overgrown grass covered the streets. Abandoned houses stood with doors swinging open. The once lively hum of medieval city life was replaced by a ghostly silence. How art captured the horror. The plague's horror was so deep that it changed art forever. Before the Black Death, medieval art focused mainly on religious themes, saints, angels, and the glory of heaven. But after the plague, art became darker and more realistic. Painters began to show death, suffering, and decay. One of the most powerful symbols of this time was the danse macabre, or dance of death. In these artworks, skeletons were shown leading kings, peasants, and children in a grim dance toward their graves. It reminded everyone that death came for all, rich or poor, young or old. Church murals, carvings, and manuscripts also began to include images of skeletons and skulls, known as memento mori, meaning, remember you must die. These were not meant to frighten people, but to remind them to live a good and moral life, since no one knew when death might come. Even centuries later, the memory of the Black Death continued to haunt the imagination of artists and writers. It changed how humanity viewed life, death, and the meaning of existence. The fall of feudalism and birth of a new order before the plague. Most of Europe followed the feudal system, a strict social structure where nobles owned the land, knights protected it, and peasants worked it in exchange for safety. But when the plague killed millions, this system began to collapse. With so many peasants dead, there were not enough workers to farm the land. Those who survived realized how valuable their labor had become. They began to demand higher wages and better living conditions. Many refused to work for their lords and instead moved to cities where they could earn more money. This caused tension between peasants and nobles. Across Europe, peasant revolts broke out, one of the most famous being the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. Although the revolts were brutally crushed, they showed that the power of the nobility was weakening. In the long run, this shift helped lead to the end of feudalism and the rise of a more modern economic system, where money and trade replaced land as the source of wealth. The world that emerged after the plague was very different from the one that had existed before. Women and the changing role of society. The Black Death also changed the roles of women in society. With so many men dead, women were often left to take care of families, farms, and businesses on their own. Some became landowners or took over their husbands' trades. In towns, women began working in areas that had previously been closed to them, such as medicine, midwifery, and shopkeeping. Although women still faced discrimination, the plague opened new paths for independence and visibility in society. In art and literature, female figures also appeared more often, sometimes as symbols of death and fate, but also as strong survivors. The plague forced medieval people to see women not only as caretakers, but as leaders and equals in times of crisis. The Black Death's impact on religion and philosophy. The massive loss of life caused many to question their faith. Why would God allow such suffering? Was it a punishment or simply fate? These questions created a spiritual crisis that changed religious belief forever. While some people became more devoted, others turned away from the church completely. The church's failure to protect people or provide answers weakened its authority. This loss of trust would later help fuel the Protestant Reformation. When figures like Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church's teachings, the plague also inspired new ways of thinking about life and the universe. People began to study philosophy, astronomy, and medicine in search of real explanations. Slowly, this curiosity grew into the Renaissance, a time of art, discovery, and scientific awakening that shaped the modern world. Lessons learned from the plague. The Black Death left behind more than just destruction. It left lessons about human resilience, adaptation, and the value of knowledge. Governments began to realize the importance of public health. Quarantine laws, waste disposal systems, and basic hygiene practices started to develop. The plague taught societies that disease could spread through contact and filth, paving the way for modern sanitation and medical research. It also showed that even in the face of overwhelming loss, humanity could rebuild. From the ashes of death came progress, creativity, and rebirth. The survivors were stronger, wiser, and more determined to make sense of the world around them. The end of the Middle Ages and the birth of a new world. Historians often say that the Black Death marked the end of the Middle Ages. Before the plague, life in Europe was controlled by tradition, religion, and rigid class systems. After it, people began to think differently about God, about themselves, and about the world. Art, science, and learning flourished. Universities grew. Trade revived. The seeds of modern Europe were planted in the soil left behind by the plague's devastation. Though it was one of the darkest times in history, the Black Death ultimately changed humanity for the better. It broke down barriers, reshaped societies, and taught people that knowledge and compassion are the strongest weapons against fear. The Black Plague destroyed millions, but it also gave birth to a new era of hope, curiosity, and renewal. From death came transformation. From despair rose the dawn of a new age, the Renaissance, the beginning of the modern world.